Lent in the General Counsel's office.
Aaron Pressberg, Senior Program Manager for Energy and Sustainability Facilities. On the CFG stuff.
Kelly Larry, Board Member.
Michelle DePass, Board Chair.
Johnson Weinberg, District Representative.
Shane Clark, Director of Community Engagement.
Julie Remenders, Board Member.
Mary Payne, Senior Legal Counsel. Liz Larch, Contracted General Counsel.
Do you all want to introduce yourself as well?
My name is Cassia Leipzig. I am on the PTSA at Winter Haven.
Mike Rosen, I'm with the Board of Schools Climate Justice.
I'm Jane Hummel, PPS parent and volunteer with Eco School Network.
Dan Young, Chief Operating Officer.
Carol Bradshaw, Executive Assistant.
Thank you. The first order item on our agenda is just a brief staff update on the student conduct and discipline policy, which is
No updates from the last meeting, but I continue to think.
So it's still in
IBB, still in IBB.
Okay,
Correct.
great.
Yeah,
We'll just keep asking for updates and
Yes.
I
I think that's a good idea.
think their target was this fall to have that completed.
Mid-November.
Mid-November, so, awesome. The next time on the agenda was also a staff update. Last committee meeting, we talked about the potential of having our policies translated. Currently, and I think historically, it's only been available in English. And Rachel, you were gonna.
Yeah, I met with the language access manager and someone from the board or the web team to discuss what options there might be for translating. It was quickly discovered that using Google, the Google Translate feature that's already on the website is not a good idea and doesn't give adequate language access to families. So the option that we discussed would be that the language access team has staff and vendors who could translate the policies and EDs into the 5 main languages that they use. And the only things that would need to be discussed among staff here are prioritizing what, they don't have the staff to just do it all at once. It would have to be a prioritization schedule. And, we would have to work with our probably assistant superintendents and meet and discuss what the best options are. And then the funding source is the other question. So that's what I have for you.
Okay, committee members, do you have any questions? Welcome, Mr. Green.
Yeah, just thinking about as we look at the budget for next year, or if that's a place where board budget might come to play as well.
And I will say that the complaint policy was translated recently into Spanish and uploaded to the website. So that's something. But if we wanted to look at it for next year with funding or start this year, I don't know. I'm not the organizer or decision maker, but it is possible to get this work started. Yes.
And Rachel, I may be misremembering, but I thought there was a decision made to have the other languages, the complaint policies being translated into the other languages also. I'm not making it, Roseanne is.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is that, I have a question, is that all of the safe harbor languages or the top 5 spoken in the district? Because I know we have multiple.
It's the top 5, and I have my notes buried, but it's simple Chinese, which is for reading of all of the various Chinese languages that it's acceptable to translate in that. It is Somali, Russian, Spanish. Yeah.
I'm going to ask that if there's like a budget implication for next year, or is it prioritization since it deals with policies, which is the board's realm, that Dr. Ailey, just be the liaison about the overall project. I think there's broad agreement that we think that's a good thing to do. And thank you for the research this last meeting.
You're welcome. So we'll talk more about possible ideas for coming and
Sure.
what that looks like. Yeah, sounds great. Thank you. Great.
Great, so the next agenda item is the climate crisis policy. And last committee meeting, we talked, we had a meeting before, we talked about a schedule of moving it out for a first reading. And we had also discussed that Shanice and her team would engage in community engagement and come back with a presentation at this meeting, which we're going to have in a moment. I'm going to ask the committee members to think just in advance of getting the community engagement is, in addition to the memo that we had included in the board materials and also the presentation we're going to see, we've received some pretty substantial other substantive changes that are being proposed. And the question for the committee will be, we had talked about sending it out with a recommendation for a first reading at this meeting in order to have it first read at the first board meeting in November. However, if we were to adopt any substantive changes or be interested in adopting substantive changes to the current draft before the next, before us recommending it for first reading, we really should, we need to allow staff some time to provide feedback on that. And I think we all need time to digest what's been proposed. I say we could decide we're just going to go with the draft we have and send it to the full board, or if we want to consider some substantive changes, and we can talk about what are those substantive changes, that we should hold it over to the next committee meeting for sort of staff feedback on those.
And we just got at 3:00, right? The latest
Yeah, so-
potential revisions about an hour ago.
Well, that was an attempt to be helpful
Right.
to committee members with, I think we all got copies on some of the substantive public comments. So what I try to do is pull that into one document so we could discuss those.
So you created this based on the feedback we got.
Yeah, it's not all of it, because,
Right.
as you know, there was a lot of it. What I tried to do is pull out what I thought were the substantive policy pieces, because there were some suggestions that were,
Operational.
Yeah. So that was more of a, to try and consolidate it for the committee discussion versus this is how, I'm going to propose an amendment, we move it out. Does that make sense? And obviously, if other people, if other committee members look through the comments and there are things that you want to elevate or that aren't in that draft, I would help.
I see you got the gardens in there.
I'd like to offer some input as well to several of the sections of the draft policy.
Awesome. Okay, so
Are we going to talk about the draft that Julia sent out with the public comments in it, or are we going to talk about the draft policy?
what we're going to do first is have Shanice present the community feedback on version 23.
Great.
And so that is, and I'm assuming you're going to share like who you all talked to and walk through that. And after that, we can talk about what changes based on that feedback and also other proposed changes we've had.
Great. So yeah, we'll hop right in. There are some slides. I don't know if we have the ability to show them or not, but if we don't, I'll roll with that.
I should note, I just looked at the screen and welcome Superintendent Guerrero. Sorry, I didn't see you there when we went around and did the introductions.
Good afternoon, Director Brim Edwards and directors. Just eavesdropping, don't mind me.
Cannot hear you, so Jose.
Just,
Yeah, so
Well, you heard it well, your ears. Sweet. And so as the slides are getting ready there, greetings everyone, I'm Shanice Clark and I'm gonna talk a little bit about the process that we were able to support to hear a really great wealth of feedback from students, members of our community and parents. And so let's hop to the next slide. And just wanna be able to name before we start that the journey of getting here is really as a result of the advocacy of our communities, our teachers, our students, folks in this very room. And so I want to be intentional about identifying that in addition to youth who have been organizing and sharing demands and wishes for our system that expand across our climate justice curriculum and practice as a system. And so we're able to kind of start conversations this way in our engagement and wanted to also be able to name that before we continue. And then our next slide, it's just naming our vision that a graduate of Portland Public Schools will be a compassionate, critical thinker, able to collaborate and solve problems and prepared to lead a more socially just world. And that is exactly, I think, exemplified when our students are engaging in learning opportunities in and outside of the classroom when they're leading in our community. And so the policy is, I think, a really great way for our system to reinforce that, and is also something that I heard across from stakeholder groups is really appreciated that we're making this step. And so there's nobody against that. So we can move to the next slide. So the policy itself was really centered around engagement plan that incorporated multiple different methods. We know that we also discussed here that reaching students and families and parents are important, but having communities of color be able to participate in the process was essential. And so we really actually developed this protocol with another effort with systems planning and performance, but used a focus group and interview protocol to be able to reach more folks. And that was especially helpful with student groups who might not be established yet, but we're able to be accessed or have a one-on-one chat with a small group. And so these are a list of some of the key groups that we were able to reach and have a number that aren't listed here, but have Cleveland, Leotis B. McDaniel, Coalition of Communities of Color, our Climate Youth Advisory, a number of other student leaders who have interacted with the board or gave testimony, and we'll get into some of their feedback and additional insights as we continue. We can move to the next slide. And so an online survey was also a part of that. I didn't name, but in addition to the focus groups, in addition to the interviews, there was a survey that we shared to the entire community, and mostly students participated, as you can see. So this is a glance here of the demographics of folks who participated, and a lot of younger age student parents. That doesn't make sense, but parents of elementary school students were that higher number there. So you can reflect on that, and we can move on to the next slide. So for our findings from the online survey, we really were able to understand that the carbon emissions goal resonated with most folks. And so that was something we wanted to be able to learn from our engagement was reflecting on that goal. There were folks who didn't
agree with the goal, and then the folks who didn't agree named that it was a little too slow or it wasn't quick enough. And so that also came across in some of our focus groups as well. But in addition, we also learned that that people are in general agreement that PPS should be in this position to help students and communities build resilience from climate change, and that area in the policy seemed to really come up in conversations a lot. And examples that were shared were safety planning or resources or even funding for students in those times. And so leaning a lot into kind of both places, maybe operational and elements of the policy as well. But I would articulate that is I think present in that pillar. And so the next point here, there is a general value for culturally responsive teaching and having communities of color and students of color be engaged in that process of developing climate justice curriculum. And so another finding is that school sites are recommended to have a climate safety plan, and some folks, maybe even students, should have a safety plan. And so those are some potential options, right, that could be more operational, but things that came up a lot as we heard from folks. On our next slide, there's some direct quotes from folks, and as you can see, there is a couple of teacher quotes we kind of highlighted here. So folks are definitely in alignment. This needs to be centered, and they're in alignment that these goals are, I think, critical. And so the second comment here, I'll just read, yes, this resonates. I believe it's on every organization and corporation to make these goals and stick to them. Plus, as a teaching institution, it would be hypocritical to encourage students to be more eco-friendly and responsible without us ourselves making those commitments. So the sentiments from teachers are similar. And so we look at the next slide here on the different findings. We'll see that core content being a place where climate justice can show up in learning and classrooms is important, and that that students and others kind of reiterating that value to expand across all content areas and the climate justice curriculum. And so I think that's also that's something embedded there into our journey and in the policy. And some notes there about the learning experiences. The guest speakers and PPS staff should collaborate with students to engage youth in hands-on climate learning. And the last slide, those learning opportunities provided can help with that resilience and preparedness for climate events, but having that happen prior to the event's occurrence, that also came up really saliently. So wanting that preparedness and intentionality before those events occur. On the next slide, there's a couple of more findings. In terms of our buildings, there's sentiment for the buildings to continue to be upgraded so they are more resilient to natural disasters and with that air filtration plan. And I think this is already articulated around our goal, but there's a portion of students that just want to make sure is known that are sharing, they're not really resonating with the goal, but if the responses to what we have learned from students and folks in the community are all linked as materials, and so there's direct quotes and direct feedback that folks will be able to refer to there. But we'll have some more quotes, just two more of the next slide. And translation came up a lot with our students. So that's something that they echoed is important to have available in these times while information is being communicated, and also the buildings piece. So it's coming up again. And so we have some key takeaways as a result of this work. And then the last couple of slides, we'll be able to reflect on that. But as you can see, from what we have been able to learn from students and folks in our engagement, is that there is this general reinforcement with the theme and the spirit of the language, but there are some other things that folks have allowed us to sit with. Also, the space where the district plays this role in educational awareness of climate events is something that seems to be, that folks are resonating with and agree is necessary. And that climate emissions goal being something that worked for many folks, but some did articulate it was not soon enough. On the last slide, there are a few more takeaways, and just want to highlight a couple, but I'll just share. There is, this is a direct quote from the Coalition of Communities of Color, but wanting to be able to be thoughtful about the language of net zero goals as they sound positive, but can open that door to false climate solutions. So like excessive carbon offset programs that are not verifiable and do not decrease community exposure to air pollution for burning fossil fuels. And so there is detailed feedback from Coalition of Communities of Color in that memo that was really, really insightful, and a number of organizations, member organizations kind of belong to this group, including Apano and key groups that we wanted to connect with. And yeah, this is deep work, and it's going to extend beyond whenever this ends. So we've got deep connections built, and we want to continue those with classroom teachers and students, and conversations that are really rich, and that will help, I think, our team and others as we're embarking on this journey to make our practice and in our curriculum work, in our policy work, and beyond. And so I'll pause here. I know there's potential for questions and other items to review as it relates to updates on the policy as well.
Great, thank you so much for doing that. The content provided back was really rich and comprehensive. Appreciate that. Why don't we start, if anybody has any questions, then maybe we can discuss it. Any questions about what was presented?
I just really appreciate the insight you shared at the end there from communities of color. This notion of like, it sounds really good on paper, like being net zero or doing carbon offset, but the real world lived impacts, especially on communities of color, need to be taken into consideration. And I think that that's something we need to keep front of mind as much as possible.
Yeah, pretty much what Ailey said. I consider myself a sustainability professional, and I really, really love and support the environmental efforts that we take in facilities and transportation, but also want to remember that, that these impacts are human caused, and we have humans in the room that we need to keep front and center. Those would be frontline communities. Those would be communities of color that feel climate impacts, negative climate impacts first, and more than when we talk about air quality. There's the Portland Harbor Coalition is also a great group to engage with. There are multiple communities of color that are working on addressing the harbor cleanup right outside our window, actually. But yeah, that I have more detailed comments that have to do with transportation impacts and our busing and our transportation patterns across the city that I think could be really impactful, that would require some audacious leadership Such as the Safe Routes to School program is great if you live in a neighborhood that you can walk to school and if you go to your neighborhood school. So I've got other comments, but I'll let other people have a chance. Let's focus on the humans. Let's hear from BIPOC, and I'd love to hear from BIPOC folks in this conversation more often personally. And really great job on that engagement. I thought it was one of the third one. Broad reaching, especially the students.
Jackson, have you participated in any of this as well, or do you want to share sort of what you heard from students in your conversations with them?
I did the Cleveland Environmental Study or Environmental Sustainability Societies class. So Shanice came in and did like a short little blurb of what the policy was and kind of what the intent was behind getting like student feedback, and then there were 2 questions that she asked us to write down answers to. I don't remember exactly what they were, but the first was like, how do you feel about the goals in the policy? And then the second was,
These are ones with the reflections.
yeah, the 2 reflection questions. They were also on the survey, right?
Yeah.
So those 2 questions. And what I heard from that group like pretty strongly was 2050 is like not good enough. 2050 is like way too late. That's like the last possible minute we can do anything and still possibly be okay. So pushing that forward was definitely like something that was emphasized. Also having resources for when we do experience more natural disasters like the wildfires or flooding or stuff like that for like the district to push out to students in the aftermath, but also like prepare students for the eventuality that those will be increasing in frequency in the coming years.
Michelle and I were just doing the math of how old we would be in 2050, and it is a really long time away.
Yeah.
And I see that Julia in the draft you sent out, you could adjust that to 2040 as a potential idea.
Yeah, that was also a theme and the community. Herman, do you have anything you want to add here, or?
Right.
Okay. Great, thank you. That was really rich, and it reminded me of like a policy is not the sole tool that we have, and that while it's important, it's also part of a much bigger, more comprehensive approach and response to the climate. And I think we just have to keep holding that, because at some point in time, it's like you just shove everything into the policy. That's going to be our approach, but really, it's the policy is one thought tool that we have that reflects our values.
May I make one additional comment, and that's that it's my personal feeling that we can't get to climate, we can't get to addressing climate until we address for other inequities. For instance, at work, we're working on this kind of concept. It's donut economics, where we have high income earners around the globe who get their needs met and then some. And then we've got other people around, other stakeholders around the globe that barely get their needs met. And part of any climate action needs to be conscious of the fact that there's haves that are able to manufacture and create carbon emissions, and those that aren't getting food to eat and living in food areas. So I think that that's a conversation I'm hoping that we see pop up in our curriculum around this, is that until we solve for inequities, other inequities in wealth and access to land and safe and healthy environments, it's going to be very, very difficult to address climate change. Because the air doesn't stop just here at PPS. So it's a broader conversation I hope our students are having, because they're going to be the ones hopefully solving for both of those issues, all of those issues.
So I think I'd like to just get a quick check on what people think about the general question of, do we want to send something out that only has slight modifications that aren't substantive for a first reading, or do we want to dive in, pick some areas where we want additional information and context? So I think that's sort of the first question, because we'll have 2 very different activities depending on the answer.
So what I would like to see us do is I really do think you've done a good job of capturing, I've been able to skim through this while we've been sitting here, capturing a lot of the public comment that we got in this policy revision that you emailed out this afternoon. So I would like us to look at running with this draft, but I do think we need to run it by staff before we then would send it out for a first reading. I would say the one thing I would like to add is the committee that we talk about, the stakeholder committee. I would like us to put in policy that that should be 50+1 bylaw. That if we're talking about this as an equity thing, we've talked about systematizing anti-racism. And I think we need to say that the makeup of this committee shall be at least more than 50%.
Okay, hold that thought, because if we do hold it over, we'll.
Yeah, so that's all of my thinking.
So, Herman, do you have a one way or a perspective one way or the other, whether you just want to send something out now, or should we?
I don't like the idea of just sending something out.
Okay. Michelle and Jackson?
I would like more time personally to digest some of the comments that came in. I responded to one person. I don't respond that often, but I was compelled. I'd like more time to digest the public comment, and I'd like to add some of my own or figure out, and I'd really love to hear from staff. I'd love to hear from staff about the operational piece, even though I know that's not the policy, but some of the facilities related, the battery storage idea, like I didn't even know solar power had batteries available. And, I mean, I was on the phone with Tesla all morning, actually for the last 3 mornings, trying to get customer service. If I knew there was a battery available, believe me, I'd be the first in line. So some of those facilities impact, I would love to hear from our staff on what we're looking at if 2040 is realistic or what the budget implications. Jackson?
I'd like to go through these recommendations.
Okay, so I think we have a consensus that we're not going to send something out for the existing one out for a first reading because we want to consider some of the substantive public comment we received, and that we may have some additional ones. So I'll note that this version 23, so everybody knows it. That's today.
It's confusing because the one you sent out also is listed as version 23.
Yeah, I think this is 24 now.
It's actually 24.
Okay.
Your
Well,
the version from this afternoon is 24, right?
So 23 is tracked changes version, and then 24, which I haven't even opened yet,
Is clean
the
version.
clean version.
But it also actually has tracked changes in
And it
it
has the track changes.
of the public
But
comments.
it's not contained.
This one came out
Sorry.
at 3 o'clock. That's what
That's
I've been
version
reading.
24.
You're supposed to read it all by the time you got to.
Yeah, I started reading this one, man.
Yeah, what?
Yeah.
So I wanted to give people the choice of because we had talked about let's get this going, and there was some comments like, what's taking you guys so long?
I do think we do need some urgency around it because we've been kind of looking at this policy for a long time, so some urgency in moving forward.
Yes, so I'm going to propose a process.
And I do think it's hard for Michelle and Herman because we did do some of that deep dive on the operational piece last year on the policy committee because we've been considering this for a while. So
Yes.
that's part of what's hard is there's history there that you haven't necessarily heard because you all weren't on the committee last year.
So I'm going to start with, and this isn't going to be your only opportunity, but I agree with Jackson. I think we should have some process that has an endpoint.
Yes.
And it is interesting, one of the recommendations was this policy should be reviewed every 5 years. So I didn't put that in because actually our policy and policy has, that it should be looked at anyway. So there are some things that were already considered, but I do think, and it's not that this is the end of the discussion, but it does allow us to get going and just have staff have a fixed point at least to start aiming at. So only at a very high level, because I don't think we have time today to wordsmith and besides when we get out, but I would like to know whether people have other things other than what's been summarized here that they would at a high level want to add. And we're going to come to the changes to the things that are already here, which will be your thing. And Michelle, you said you had specific language around transportation that you
Yeah, changes around how we could address through our transportation systems, and also I have a note here, under pillars 2 and 3, that I say human and culturally responsive. I just, to share with everybody, a program I was hired to manage, in January of 2020 went away recently, and that was because we recognized that the framing, the naming, everything about this program was very environmentally focused, and it wasn't focused on the human side. The other thing is we found out we weren't serving businesses owned by people of color in a citywide program, and so I'd like to provide more substantive comments to those two areas.
The pillars 2 and 3
To pillars 2 and 3.
with the focus on the humans impacted.
Right. So sustainability. There's 3 legs of the stool. There's the environment, people, planet, and profit. This addresses the planet really well, and less so on the other 2. So I'd like to just add my comments about that area.
Okay, and so we're gonna talk about these things, then we'll talk about when people should get things to circulate, so people have time to look at them, including both committee members and staff. So I've got a placeholder for that.
I think also at the higher level, I think a common theme that she's commented on was also just around like preparedness for natural disasters or the eventuality of like getting to this point where we are like past the climate crisis, we're full-fledged like
The
earthquake.
The Katrina and
Yeah.
I think I think actually the preparedness piece is also ties into our equity goals, because we know from other areas around the country that these terrible impact for people of color quite dramatically. I was thinking of Katrina, but we have multiple others. So I think that's wildfires.
So I see some of that in here.
Heat wave.
I see some of that in here, but Jackson, what I would ask is if you could post some specific language that you think would address that for the committee to consider.
Yeah, it'd probably fall under education, which I know is.
Yeah, I was just looking at that. But goal 3.43. Any other additions that are included? Staff or?
I think what staff is trying to do is gather the areas of inquiry and addition, so we can go back and assess again how we would do it and what it would look like, what the impacts would be, budget, operational and otherwise. So I think we're mostly in a listening mode for today's meeting on this new content.
I want to make sure.
No, I appreciate the inquiry, and I don't mean to speak entirely for Dan and Erin, but I think that's our next step.
Can I ask, this is a little bit tangent, do we have a policy that addresses like sustainable or local purchasing? Do we have that on the books already? Does anybody know?
I think we have some in the purchasing and contracting guidelines, but I'm going from generalized memory. So why don't we follow up with specifics so the committee members can see what it is? We'll email that out. I know that one of the, as this policy has been developed and the various stakeholders have worked together, one of the things that Erin did was visit each department whose core functions or functions period were impacted by the proposed policy to understand what that would mean and what the effects of that were, the impacts. And so this, I want to say version 23, but anyway, the one before today's red lines reflected that conversation, that information, and that draft. So I think that process would continue with proposed amendments that are here and that are going to be generated in the conversation today.
So what I'd like to see us do today would be to work on this for some time, and then maybe have people, like Michelle, if you have some additional comments, send those in to Julia to the next meeting I think it's, our next meeting is November 10th. That we would have another, just like today, we had a draft to say, are we ready to send this on? for our first reading. So I'd like to see if we could, again, it's this, we've been working on this for over a year. We do want to show that we are taking the students seriously when they say this is urgent, and we do want to be all in on this. I want us to do it carefully and well, but I would like to see us come back with the draft for the next.
Yeah, ideally, what I'd like to do is identify those areas where if individual committee members want to propose language, that we have a deadline well before the committee meeting, so then staff has an opportunity to also reflect on and share our point of view.
I'm putting it in the calendar, but I'll add a week.
Okay, well, we'll, at the end of this, we'll get to a timeline.
It's 3 weeks to our next meeting, but that does give us some good time there to.
Okay, so that's the universe of things that we, that aren't here. Now I'd like to ask, of the things that are here, are there comments on them? Ailey?
I've made my comment about, I think we need to put into policy that the committee, if we're gonna do that, is 50% plus 1.
Will you
I love
provide,
that.
will you provide some,
Operationalize the equity values.
sorry, would you provide some language
Yes.
on that? Anything else in the comments?
I like the 2040. I think that's a better goal. I'm just wondering, I think we talked about why 2050, maybe talking about can we have 2040?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that will be the staff analysis, because I was trying to think through, so there's a lot of building related pieces, and if you think between now and 2050, that potentially could be another 4 bonds or another 5 bonds. And like, would we be done with all our schools? Would we still have some of these schools that don't have all these sustainability features? So it's a great question, and it's like, well, could you be 2040 on, almost all of it, with the exception of the schools that haven't been approved? But I think that's what we should hear from the staff. Because it may be, we want to have the urgency of 2040, and we think we can do that on all these things, but the reality is, we have 80 buildings that we got to work through, and we can't do them all at once.
If 2040 is hard, I think that's good. If it's impossible, that's not.
That's the perfect way to put it, Jessica. Hard is good, impossible is not good.
Well, and there's a reason why, I'm not sure why we settled on 2050, but there are like 2030, 2040 goals, 2050 goals, depending on whatever IPCC or some of these other regulations.
I think if I were to add something to this conversation, I think it would be around that as a school system, we're educators, right? We're supposed to be educated. And so as much as we're hearing all this from students and different ones saying, we need to do more and we need to get this together, as a school system, we should be doing this. I think all that is well and true, but I think if we're going to come from the position of our job is to educate, then I think that there should be something in there as to where we're educating the students around what are you doing besides feeling entitled to yell at a school to say we want you to do more, but are you yelling at your home, right? So are we educating you around taking the same energy that you're putting towards as a school system? We want you to do this, this, and this. And I feel like we've entitled them to feel as though they can do all these things, and that we're shamed if we don't. But I think what we should be reminded is that we're educators, and that part of that is also educating you around not just saying what you should be saying at the school, but what are you saying in your own homes? You know what I mean? Like, are you letting the water run while you brush your teeth? Are you using the microwave? Are you moving your house and telling your parents, Mom, Dad, why are we using solar power? Because we're trying to bring down our climate. We're trying to be a part of it. Or are we just empowering them to believe that it's okay to come to the school and say, you guys got to do better, and that, that's where the change takes place. So I feel like it's up to us to remind students, families, and everything And our job is to educate. And so, yes, we should be doing something, and looking at different ways that we can do to try to, to reduce that footprint. But if you're not yelling at home at your parents, telling your parents, don't put we need solar panels. If you're not yelling at home about we need to eat all our food and stop wasting food, if you're not yelling at home, then stop yelling at me, because quite frankly, I don't want to hear it. And so
We had a really great climate curriculum exercise last year where we actually, as a board, got to go through one of the climate lessons that our teachers teach our students.
mhm.
And it was this, part of it that will always stick with me was this incredibly powerful poem from two indigenous voices, one whose island is like being taken over by the ocean.
Yeah.
And this other woman that was in a more northern country with the ice receding. And it was definitely like really talking about the impacts of climate on the world and how each person is individually responsible for exactly what you're saying. How am I living my life? And we're getting some pressure from students around our organization to make changes, but the curriculum that PPS is using really does help. That just exactly what that graduate portrait is, of giving our students the agency to like live into the future they want, which is one where they are responsible and understand the things they can do to help. Exactly what you were saying.
And I think that's part of where our focus should be. Like, yes, and it's not to say, one is better or worse than the other. I think it's a yes and scenario as to where there are simple things that you can be doing at home. And if you're not doing those things, and I think this is where we tell people to take an honest look at themselves, because you can lie to me, but at the end of the day, if you're leaving your phone plugged in longer than you need to leave your phone plugged in. Because if you leave your phone plugged in longer than it needs to and it's got a full charge, then you're actually hurting the environment as well. It's that simple. So if you're not going to take care of those simple things, then I think that we need to just stop. Just stop it. I don't want to hear it if you're not doing it. It's hypocritical. And so you're right. We got Islander families who their homes are about to be lost. That's real. That's a real thing. That's really happening. And those families are doing a lot of different things, making a lot of noise around that fact. That's real. I'm just tired of hearing people that aren't really taking care of stuff at home come and bicker over here because they feel like, I can and they won't tell me no. I'm the first one to tell you shut up.
Yeah. You and the Queen, I don't know if you saw that she was on a hot mic and she said, I hate people who just talk about this and don't actually do anything. But I think you're absolutely right. And I think Erin did a really masterful job of, every year we get kids coming to tell us, we need to have less plastic in our cafeterias. Well, what we've really seen is that the places that PPS is having the biggest environmental impact are around transportation and water usage. And so, we can put a lot of time and energy into plastic forks, which we probably should do. And the things that are going to have the biggest long-term environmental impact are these bigger issues around fuel usage and water. Waste is part of it too, but those are kind of the big ones. So I feel like sometimes we spend a lot of our energy on the environmental pieces that are like low-hanging or sexy. I don't know if plastic forks can be sexy, and we don't get to, the toilets, the running water, the buses, the diesel, some of those bigger questions, which is where if we really want to make a difference for those Islander families and others, that's where we need to be focusing our impact as an organization, but also helping educate our students about the things they can do, like flying less, that do have a huge environmental impact.
I was gonna say, every parent knows the day that their kid learned about recycling. I work in solid waste, so anyway, same can be changed, and we should encourage students of color and actually we should encourage all of our students to have environmental education. And just because this is what they're gonna go into in college or life. I just want to say, people of color, I'll speak for Black folks, have always had a sustainability. It's been around economics. It's been around your grandmother telling you not to leave the door open because you don't want to eat outside, or using your scrap materials if you're making a dress or something, or composting your food. So it's always been. It's not just a mainstream white environmental thing. It's some communities are economically forced to address climate change and sustainability. But I think this curriculum needs to be available and encouraged for all kids. Otherwise, we end up having a segregated, green club.
I think we saw that in the comments as well, right, Shanice? But that was one of the highlighted pieces.
I'm gonna call on Jonathan, and then I'm gonna, just looking at the time, Ray Brown.
No, I just appreciate the comments around the education and what's happening in the classroom. So just, and, you know, 3 months into this, so we are looking to become the first district in the country with a K-12 climate justice curriculum, thanks in large part to the advocacy of our students. So over the last few years, including an investment from PGE of $250,000 to develop an open source curriculum that really takes into account how do we talk about climate justice from the science discipline, the history, social science perspective, and then how do we integrate it throughout the continuum of education. So it's in there, and in terms of, I mean, it's not in there now, but that's the work that's underway. The other thing that we did last year, or this year for the first time, I believe, and Shanice can correct me if I'm wrong, we have a high school elective program across the district that was fully developed by educators and students in partnership or with support from central office. So just kind of give you a little bit of, yes, the educational piece is important, and how do we operationalize it as a community, as a globe, is also important. So I just wanted to give that a little bit more nuance or color to the curriculum piece of it.
So as a way of organizing Herman's comments and then the following discussion, and then Jonathan, I'm looking at 3.26 of the, I guess, number 24, the circle 23. So it has something, but it says opportunities, talking about students, for them to practice using systems thinkings to inform their choices. What I would suggest, Herman, if you can work with Jonathan or whoever appropriate from the staff to, I think, make that language sound less.
Where are you, Julia?
I'm on
3.2.
Okay.
Because I was switching between versions, so I got a little.
It's like it's the one that I sent.
Yeah, version 24.
Okay, so there's on 3.2, there's a new 6 that talks about students, opportunities for them to practice using system thinking to inform their choices, which isn't a very student-friendly way of saying like more hands-on, or how do they put that in practical use to their life. So just as a takeaway, if maybe translate that into a more student, and maybe working with Jackson on how that could be translated into something that's more student-friendly to capture your point, Herman.
So Herman, Jackson, and Jonathan are on team 3.2, 3.26, or whatever it is.
3.26.
I think that's what it's
Version 23.
There was a lot in 3.2. I'm 3.26.
Okay, so here's how we're gonna finally move ahead. So just pulling up my calendar. So the next meeting is the 10th. I would ask those of you now who have assignments by October, say 26th or 27th, to circulate it to the committee members. Okay. And then I'm going to ask from a staff perspective, the substantive additions, like the scope, adding scope 1, the purchasing piece, the task force, when is it reasonable to get staff feedback? So it'd be ideal not to have it right before the committee meeting, again, so we could have a discussion so we're ready to hopefully take action.
I defer to Erin and Dan about what's realistic about these areas and how long it will take.
But you need to see also the 24 language on that.
That's what she's saying, by the 26th or 27th, we'll have that, and then from
Oh, from there, okay, sorry.
From there, how long will
I say, I look through here, and some of these things I don't view as really substantive. Staff can comment on them, but there are some ones that I do think are substantive that that the 2040 question, the scope 1 question, the task force. So again, having a staff perspective.
So just going off the ones that you have on this document, one you sent out today.
And plus what's coming, there are more coming, so.
Okay.
Plus the ones that just were, the 2 to 3 that were mentioned here, and maybe Michelle might have.
Yeah, I think it's fine for us to have a week before the next meeting, have a staff response out.
So like November 2nd?
That works. Good try.
So it's a week. I just wanna, I'm not trying to talk you out of it, I just wanna make sure that, what, 1 week to process and assess across.
So, spring second.
A week from,
That gives
2 weeks
Aaron,
from today.
yeah, no,
Well,
when
from
you
the-
get, gives you a week to do the work. I'm
From
just
the,
making sure we've got, everyone's tracking.
I don't know that the ones that are gonna come on the 26th and 27th are gonna be
Yeah, the 2040 and other questions.
something, I think we've already flagged what I would think would be the major ones that's for staff to come back with.
I was wondering about the transportation piece.
Oh,
That
yeah,
might-
so that's the one outlier.
And if I'm working with John, education.
So I'm sorry, multitasking. The transportation piece, I could talk about it all day long. I just need a deadline. I put it in my calendar, I think, for the.
October 26th and 27th.
Oh, okay, that's a little ahead of, I think I have it on Halloween. I can do it.
Well, if it's something that's a big change,
If it's
then we want
substantive.
staff to have an opportunity to.
Okay. Promise.
no worries.
I have a question about version. So if we're all sending like different documents from our own edits, who's bringing it all together?
Excellent question.
Oh my gosh.
Okay,
We do use, well,
so everybody has this version. And I think we have identified 4 places where there's going to be potential, and you know who you are. So if you can send it to myself and who, from a staff perspective, who do you want that to be?
Send it to Mary, but yeah.
Okay, so send those to Mary and I. And then I feel like because we have, and maybe Roseanne, you can change this to version 24. That everybody should operate off of 24. Is that,
Yes, because my part that I'm amending doesn't exist on 23, so that makes a lot more sense.
okay, so there'll be a new 24, it'll be posted and circulated and
Google Doc?
Pardon?
Is it a Google Doc that we're all gonna work off of?
No, it should not be a Google Doc because there you have a forum. So it can be a Word doc where that you can individually send.
I actually don't think it's gonna be that hard, so Michelle's gonna send some transportation one, you're gonna send a piece, of staff's gonna have one unified, hopefully, piece,
I'm
so.
also gonna, in pillars 2
Oh, 2 and 3, that's right.
I also
Maybe
have
not.
minutes or suggestions.
So it may take me, so I get it out to you all on the 28th. Just try to give you time so you see, and what is the 28th? Thursday.
I think we know where the target we're trying to hit. If when all of those edits come in, if there's a problem, we'll let you know.
Yeah, I mean, we
But I
have
think,
a-
well, that's
we
the
have a
timing we'll
defined
strive for.
universe.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna say that is the defined universe, and if there's anything else, that will be, the revisions in 2 years, where it may actually live somewhere else and not actually in the policy.
One last thing, we have a 2050 goal later on, are we gonna have to?
Where is
That's
that?
under pillar 1.1 of the version. In all existing buildings.
Well, it seems like it should mirror, so Aaron, in the sort of analysis of the 2050 for the rest of it, I'm not sure why we have a separate.
Yeah, whatever it ends up being, if it's 2040 or 2050, it should be the same.
Okay, great. Okay, anything else? And then I want to ask, is anybody who has signed up for public comment today, instead of doing it at the end of the meeting, if it was relating to climate, I think it would make sense to do it now.
3 people signed up.
On climate?
Yes.
Okay, let's take that public comment now. There's approximately 2 minutes from, Vera.
Mike Bruton?
Okay. So I just wanted to thank staff putting together the community input or outreach program under such a tight time frame.
Mike, could you be a little louder? I'm sorry, I'm getting old.
So I want to just thank staff for gathering all the community input and all the work they did under a tight time frame and how they organized all the information fed back to us. There was a lot there. It was a big job. We appreciate the effort. We're supportive of advancing the draft and adopting it as quickly as possible, but we do think also want to see public input reflected in a new draft before it's sent to the board. So everything you're talking about, we agree with. I just wanted to highlight a couple of changes that are particularly important to us. Most of them are included in the comments that the Climate Justice Committee Eco School Network submitted, but there are a few others that we're adding that we gleaned from input from others. Like we discussed, we think there should be a more ambitious target date set for net zero, so we're asking for 2040. And just want to note, students in the September 24th climate strike were asking the city for net zero for 2035. We think the net zero goal should be reached without carbon offsets, and that was one of the comments that you guys talked about that came out of the Coalition for Communities of Color. We need to explicitly state scope 1 and scope 2 be included in schools tracking greenhouse gases. And then on transparency and accountability, this policy requires regular and publicly available progress reporting, and its implementation would benefit from collaboration with stakeholders. It's not enough for transparency and accountability to be written into the administrative directive. It must be outlined in the policy to include regular updates to the board as well as a group of stakeholders, including frontline community, particularly communities of color, students, parents, teachers, scientists, administrators, businesses, environmental nonprofits, and PPS Climate Justice. And then one last thing. In terms of you guys turning this around with staff comments, will that be available to the community before the next board policy committee meeting? Will we be able to see?
We will, I'll answer, but let's get to the public comment and then we'll.
Okay.
Thank you for your
Can
comment.
you come up?
Thanks. I'm going to add on directly from Mike's comments and continue on some of the things that we submitted in our written comments. I want to echo also this thanks to staff for getting such great public input in a short amount of time. Energy efficiency, I want to highlight this and strengthen. We'd love to see the language around that strengthen, just to really emphasize the need to look for efficiency before we backfill with low carbon energy production. Also, composting, that was lost somewhere along the way. There were previous drafts where it was mentioned, and we just want to highlight the huge impact of food waste, and also both in terms of volume from PPS and also the GHG emissions associated with methane gas from food waste. So we'd like to see that added into goal 1.2.2. Also want to emphasize these high visibility actions. So we appreciate that PPS wants to prioritize efforts with high visibility, it says something about largest environmental return on investment for immediate action. And that's great, we support that, but we also want to see high visibility and highly symbolic items be implemented. For example, specific language around supporting dishwashers and milk dispensers for school nutrition program infrastructure, standardized recycling bins at every school for equity reasons, eliminating single-use items in the cafeteria. We've heard students over and over talk about this as something that is a bother. And 100% recycled content paper would also fall into this category. Purchasing, we acknowledge that purchasing changes are going to be significant and it's not going to be easy and it will probably take some time. But shifting PPS procurement of products and services toward climate justice goals is going to be imperative for successfully implementing this policy. And we also want to encourage PPS to stop accepting sponsorships from fossil fuel companies. We see some examples around, for example.
Can you wrap up your comments? And you can also feel free to send them to the committee members.
Okay. We want to see gardens at every school. And I wanted to add, there was a discussion around 3.2.6 as the place for that hands-on learning opportunities. And I think 3.2.5 is actually perhaps a better place for that because it already references that. And we did hear that from tons of teachers ourselves when we chatted about it. And then lastly, if we
I'm sorry,
can
we have to.
Okay.
Please feel free to send comments and we'll take them into consideration.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mayor Vice.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Dana Bissey and I'm a policy analyst at Metro, but I'm also really here as a parent. But I'm speaking kind of from a professional standpoint in terms of this knowledge around greenhouse gas inventories. And I had a few comments about your protocol. And the first is really, I reiterate a lot of the emphasis on 2040 target. The science-based targets are really clear. We need to have a 2040 goal or sooner. When it comes to, I think that also generally having more interim and more ultimate targets would be helpful as part of this policy. There isn't anything about when you plan to have clean energy or when you plan to phase out gas-powered equipment. I think that it would be really helpful to have some of those targets in the plan, whether it's about disposables and elimination of single use. When you're doing your greenhouse gas inventory, it's important that you follow standard protocol and include all scopes of emissions. The plan talks about scope 2, which is your indirect sources, so heats and cools and buildings. Scope 1 needs to be more reiterated or emphasized, and that's your fleet and your fuels, your refrigerants. But especially scope 3 can actually be some of the largest sources of emissions for any organization. And so it's mentioned talking about waste, but specifically you should be looking at your full scope 3 emissions. And the reason for that is because it's your impact is that you have a lot of investment of dollars and your contracts that you are hiring people for, the food that you're ordering, the materials that go into buildings. You can have significant impact in that way. And you can set lots of centralized purchasing filters in terms of meeting certain racial diversity, equity, climate justice criteria. 100% post-consumer content recycled paper, low carbon materials. If you don't include if you're not tracking those emissions through your scope, it's really going to be hard to understand how you can have impact. So I really encourage you to take a much more comprehensive look at your scope 3 emissions. Because you can really, with your procurement, you can emphasize your values. But last point is this is a really opportune moment to be change makers and climate leaders and to identify Portland as being a climate leader and a reputation that I think parents and students and you all as board members can be really proud of. So I encourage you to really see this opportunity and go for it. And be very aggressive and bold and know that it's a learning process and you have to keep coming back and fine-tuning it, but it's worth it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all three of you for your continued engagement with the committee and the board and the school district around this policy. I have just two comments. One, in terms of when will the staff feedback be available? We'll post documents when they're ready for public posting. And we are working on this committee this year is always having things ready Friday before. So if not earlier, but that is the deadline. So when they're ready to be posted, we'll try and have them up and available so that people can comment on them or sign up to testify or provide public comment. And the second question, I just want to re-emphasize again that the committee will be making sort of determinations also in consultation with staff on what is appropriate to have in policy and what may live somewhere else. So just because something doesn't live in policy doesn't mean the district's not going to embrace it or do something, but it may mean it's just not, we've determined it's not, the policy isn't the place to have it there. So I just want to that out there as just as a reminder, when you look at drafts, that's something that may not be there. Anything else for the good of the order before we move off of this committee item? Okay, great, thank you to everybody, and we have some deadlines and look forward to moving that along. Thank you, everybody. The next item on our agenda is something that was from last. Okay, I'm just gonna skip around just for a moment and ask staff. I'm going to agenda item number 7, which is policies and public comment period. Have we received any? I don't want to know whether we have any. Have we received any public comment on policies number 7, those that are out for first reading? Because normally we would consider those as part of this meeting. No? No. Okay. So we can that agenda. Thank you all for coming and joining us today. So we can cross off agenda item number 7. All right, so the next agenda item, committee discussion on policy revision distribution. This is an idea I'm going to ask for each of the committee members and our student representative to come up with 5 to 10 entities that when we're in the process of making policy changes that aren't really internal focused, but more externally focused, of like who should get that in terms of having some broader sort of push out the policy revisions versus they didn't come to the committee meeting or they didn't see it at the first reading at the board meeting. And so, for example, right now, if we have something just generally, it just gets sent to PAT versus having some sort of broader distribution. And I am going to tap each one of you to think of community stakeholders who we should include in our policy distribution when we're changing policy, because there's nothing worse than I feel like as a board member to like go through a long process and then you think you've nailed it and you're like, I had no idea you were doing that. And I think of like groups of like our other employee groups, our CBOs that we work with, student groups, and there's gonna be some policies where people are just like, delete that. That's an internal facing kind of more internal, but other ones have really broad implications. I'll just say, like, for example, search and seizure policy, when we did it 2 years ago, parents and students, especially those who potentially are affected, had a point of view. Student discipline, who should we be including? So I am going to send a note to each one of you and ask for you to suggest entities, and I'd love for staff also to do that, just as a way to have the policy work get broader ownership by the community.
That's great.
Is that okay? Is that all?
You can send it to you.
Okay. I will send
Bullet list.
a bullet point list, yes, and you can. And I know since Ailey loves contests.
Woo! I just like to be first. Let's be real clear. Oh, I responded to the digital poll like.
It's not quality, it's just like speed.
It's not quality, it's just speed. Yeah, exactly.
Coming in last on that one, which is very interesting.
Okay, so that is that item, and I'd love to, especially as we're getting into, as we're moving out of some of these ones that are more ministerial and more into the substantive ones that impact our students, that we, our students and families, that we are sending it out to a broader group. And Jackson, I'd love for you to take it to the DSC and get their feedback as well. Okay.
You have a deadline?
I totally missed, sorry, agenda item number 4. Um, so this is the time that I know everybody was looking forward to. These are number 4 is, we've committed to working through and cleaning up our policies, and so we have 5. We have 6 policies that are being proposed for rescissions, and I don't know if everybody's had a chance to go through them, but if Liz and Mary, do you want to do like a 1 sentence on each of them?
Sure, I'm happy.
And then so 1 sentence on each of them, if anybody, the practice we'll have is if anybody has a major issue with the rescinding of a policy, then we likely will set it aside, because this is designed to be the low-hanging fruit right now.
Okay, I'll try to go in numerical order, see if I can, one sentence. The traffic safety patrols, 3.40.091. Our assessment is that the policy is somewhat out of date. It's fairly weak policy language. It doesn't need to be in a policy. We certainly need to have strong traffic safety around our schools, but this policy isn't needed to do that. The second one is student interviews and errands, 4.50.010. I should note last updated in 2002. It's an odd one, a little odd and outdated on the sending students out to run errands, which is actually quite inappropriate.
That was.
Yeah,
it is a thing though.
Unless the parents see it.
Like you can go get coffee for
And I think the interview part is covered in the search and seizure policy. We were really clear about not allowing access.
Yeah.
In that policy.
Yes, and the professional conduct policy covers inappropriate relationships that may show favoritism or things that might be signs of grooming. So we think this is outdated and unnecessary. Just a pretty common refrain. The next one, health services, 4.50.020. Where to begin? This was last updated in 2002. There's a complex relationship with MESD and their statutory provisions in play, contracts in play with, again, MESD and others, there are other resolutions. Like it's a very simplistic, outdated statement that does nowhere mirrors what actually happens in schools across the district. Dental health services, 4.50.023, again, last amended in 2002. The statutes upon which this is based have been repealed. It's not needed for the dental clinics. Again, we do that through contracts, and again, a much more comprehensive program. It's not that medical services and dental health services aren't important, it's just that these policies don't match the practices. There is a fabulous picture on the Assistance League of Portland website, though. We looked it up the other day. Someday I'll show it to you. Physical and mental health of staff members, 5.20.100. This is, again, it's outdated. While the district, by collective bargaining agreement and other HR practices, conducts fitness for duties assessments when needed for employees, there is no a medical advisor who is appointed. This is an outdated model for those services also. And then career education learning opportunities, 6.10.013. It's just not really a policy. Career education is very important, but the language here, it just doesn't inform or direct or provide. There's a lot of enthusiasm for a very important project, but not a policy. I think it's how we assessed it. That's 2 sentences each, sorry. maybe semicolons for a few.
As long as it's not the Oxford comma, because that's not in my grammar toolbox.
It's there every time.
Oxford comma.
Do any committee members have questions about any of the policies?
There's 3 references in the bottom. One's an AD to a policy. What's gonna happen if we do resend? Like if we resend these, are there references from those policies in these policies then?
References need to be cleaned up. ADs may or may not be amended, rescinded, or moved. It'll depend on the content and where they go. And it's a mixed bag. We looked at, depending on the policy, sometimes the AD isn't obvious, just it gets rescinded by the superintendent along with the policy rescission. Other times the content needs to go elsewhere.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think we don't want to have the practice of having like an AD that's not connected to any policy.
We're looking at that.
I think I think we're trying to figure out, I would focus less on is an AD connected to a policy and where does the information appropriately sit, right? Like where do you go to find it? And is it content for a policy? Is it content for an AD? Does it sit in the employee handbook, but not make employees chase it or other people chase it in multiple places? So I think we're trying to look at that holistically.
Okay.
Where is the reference?
It's a good question.
I'm confused about where the reference is in this law enforcement. So those 3 listed below, I understood them to be policies that covered those other ones, not that 4.50.010 was mentioned in the professional conduct. So that's what I'm asking. There's a reference to 4.50.010 in the professional conduct between adults and students.
Yeah.
We need to clean that up.
Oh,
Well, that was.
Yeah. So if they're referenced in another policy and then they are rescinded, that other policy needs to be
Cleaned up.
Cleaned up.
I can't find where it's referenced. That's the.
I can't tell you where it's referenced right now.
I see.
So 4.50.010 is referenced in those bottom 3. One's an AD. And you're looking for it? Yeah, I'm looking for it too.
It says for physical contact with students, it's at the bottom.
Okay. Any physical redirection of students must be pursuant to the district's physical restraint. That's 4.0.060 AD.
What are we trying to solve? I'm
We're trying
not
to find
tracking
where
the
the
document.
references. So who takes responsibility for cleaning up these policies, and then do we need to? What's the process of fixing these references if we rescind these policies?
If it is a simple renumbering, if it's nothing that involves substance, we just change them so they're accurate.
Okay.
If there's substantive change, we bring them to the policy committee.
But the references to the search and seizure and the professional conduct are to let you know that there is language, there's updated language that we follow, and so the student errands and
Okay.
Yes, like
it's
my
all
question-
necessary
My
because we
question on
have
it,
it
like the errands was, okay, staff shouldn't be asking students to do that?
Yeah.
But like, so if we get rid of this, where does that reside somewhere else?
Yeah.
And it resides in professional conduct.
Right.
And same thing with the interviews, it
Okay.
provides.
So that answers my question. There is no reference in these policies to 4.04501.
No.
The things we're taking out, like don't send students on errands, are
Addressed
covered inside these other policies.
So
Great.
we would welcome any guidance about how to present that in an agenda so it's clear. Some are reference and some are proposed changes. If
Yes.
that's what-
So these are references, we're good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No changes need to happen to these other policies. Great.
Anything else? I'd like to ask the committee if you're supportive of recommending them for our first reading to the board.
Yes.
Okay, Bria and Jackson, from the student representative standpoint.
This is
Most
great.
of the other stuff is covered.
This is great for Rachel and I because it means less to translate. Because my understanding is you and I are going to do all the translating, right?
Are we?
Amy told me she's all in for that.
I just need to tell you that I'm in the legal department.
Volunteer for school Chinese.
No.
She's just gonna go help get the money if we need it.
I'm going to get the money. I'm going to work on the money.
We'll do a fundraiser.
And so that we don't lose this in our bigger policy work. All right. Let's see. Great.
So those will be up for our first reading on the 26th.
Assuming we have time?
Yes.
Great. I think we have on the 2nd.
Yes.
Yeah, oh, we had it on the second.
Just the
Okay.
following
On
week.
this,
That's fine.
I just don't know if we have enough time to, we'll see.
on the
No,
second,
but
okay.
it'll be soon.
Sorry, I was nodding.
Unless people really want to get those rescinded.
Will there be a vote on this one? Second reading?
I believe so. The second reading for the first batch of rescissions.
Will be voted.
So the second batch, this is the third. So
The
the
second
last
batch.
meeting.
The
second
You
batch
don't
will be
realize it,
second.
but we are on our third batch.
Yeah.
The public comments that were read the last meeting will be voted on the second.
On the
Okay,
second,
got
okay.
it.
That's 20.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So these are first reading, second batch will be second reading, third batch will be voted. Sorry, first batch will be voted.
Has been voted.
Has been
voted
voted on.
and
Second,
it's off the
second
website.
will be voted on. It'll be the second reading.
These will be
These will be first.
Okay.
A little orientation.
When we get to like the 14th, it's going to be like,
Oh my gosh.
I don't care how big.
It'll be nice not to have to scroll. Or control.
Okay, so the next item is just a discussion item. No, I'm starting to get organized.
Take a minute. Oh, great.
So, our next agenda item relates to, the general topic of, fundraising for FTE. And I distributed or had posted the current policy. The current policy on the foundation, and in addition, the current policy, thank you, on parent fundraising, and then also a policy proposal that was sent to the board about a year and a half ago regarding current fundraising. This is, fundraising for FTE. And this has been an issue that has been out swirling in the PPS community ever since the late 90s, when through a resolution the board approved school communities being able to buy FTE or fundraise for FTE. And then also there was at that time a 1/3 going to the Portland Schools Foundation. So there is a policy proposal that came to us from the parent group, the Reform PPS Funding Group. And since it was submitted since it was posted yesterday or Sunday, the group, the Reform PPS Funding, has subsequently sent a revision to their proposal, which I forwarded it to committee members and staff. In addition, Jonathan has circulated to the committee members some materials from the May 10th meeting as well. And this isn't a long agenda item today, but I thought what it would be is an opportunity for committee members to surface what information they need or would want in order to look at this from a policy standpoint. And so that's one thing. And given that the policy that was posted is now somewhat different. I asked Beth Kavanaugh to just briefly, there she is, just briefly to describe what this is. This is not an, not an opportunity to advocate for it, but just to explain the difference between what was submitted a year and a half ago and then was posted and with what was sent.
I just want to, before, Beth, thank you for being here, and before you get started, I would say that I'm very disappointed, because the last time we had talked about this, I know one of the things we had talked about was looking at community and parent fundraising as a whole. And I think the intention of this changing to the foundation being about equity and shifting is really important, but I feel like we are not having a full conversation and we're not talking about PTA fundraising and ways that we can look at equity fully. Because one of my fears, and Beth, I know we've talked about this with your group, is that if foundations stuff happening in the local schools, I think a lot of the money will just divert to PTAs, and which is less equitable because there isn't even the 1/3 match in PTA. So I really want us as a policy committee, I think rather than just looking at the foundation policy as our first step, I think we need to have a policy around parent and community-based fundraising comprehensively. Because having worked in that at both Llewellyn and Selwood and both the PTA and the foundation, and learning what I've learned since I've come on board, there are huge inequities about what PTAs can provide for schools in different locations. And I think it's something we really need to have a conversation. And I think Portland as a city to really be thoughtful about, yes, it's important to fundraise and advocate for our own kids, and it's important to think of the whole city as our own kids. So there's a piece there of like, yes, this is really important, and I feel like it's half a tricycle.
What I'd like you to do is put it in the form of question. What information do you need? Because I think there is the question about buying FTE, which very clearly PPS has, like we're the only ones who can hire staff. And there's a question about everything else. So what I like you to think, Ailey, is like what questions do you have about that other piece that we can, let's say, this is primarily an opportunity to surface policy questions and surface questions about the information.
So I think my question would be, can we do a policy on all parent fundraising rather than just on foundation? Parent and community. So that's my question is, can our policy be more global and be on all parent and community-based fundraising rather than just foundation specific? And there may still need to be changes to the foundation policy as part of that, but I'd like us to start with that bigger picture of our fundraising systems rather than tinkering with changes to the foundation first. I'd like us to start bigger.
Okay.
That's my question. Can we start bigger?
Great. And before I get to everybody else's questions, I didn't have time to look at it, so can you like just give us a quick highlight of what you're proposing that's different from the original policy?
Yes. So thank you for inviting me to give this context on this second policy. Our intention is this would be considered alongside the policy revision that we submitted last year. This is in order to encourage conversation and consideration of the nuances around this issue of FTE fundraising. Upon listening to various stakeholders and continuing our work, it's clear that a range of solutions should be considered in order to reform the current foundation fundraising policy. So the key differences with this revision is that it does not strike out the instructional staff as one of the expenses that the district foundation may fund. Instead, it specifies that donated funds for FTE, which may come from a range of sources, including parent groups, but also other sources of donors, would be collected through a central fund managed by the district foundation. The intent is to propose the establishment of this central fund distributed using a transparent process or formula with equity at its center as a mechanism for fundraising for FTE. The central fund would take the place of individual school fundraising for staff through local school foundations or independent foundations. However, it would not end or close those local foundations. For example, some stakeholders, including Board Member Director Lowry, expressed concern that schools with the highest needs could be hurt if foundation fundraising was simply done away with, because they would no longer receive those parent fund awards. This instead ends the ability for individual school communities to retain a set percentage of funds raised for the purpose of funding staff within their own buildings. But the district foundation may continue to raise funds for additional FTE through a variety of donors, including those local school and independent foundations, parents or local donors or other sources. But the district would then be able to ensure that those funds are used where they're most needed to meet district goals. The policy committee could then consider language that would allow the district to direct contributions from that central fund towards individual schools with large populations of underserved students for targeted purposes, as long as these kinds of things were done with transparency and adherence to those district goals. A secondary goal that was included in both the previous draft and this one is including transparency measures as far as the private funding of FTE or other contracted or support staff in PPS schools. In order to develop the necessary trust with the community so that they see the benefits of supporting a central fund for FTE rather than donating to their own school, the distribution of this FTE and how it moves the district closer to the PPS vision will need to be apparent. And finally, we believe that this policy, 7.10.030-P, providing guidance for the district foundation, needs to be revised to ensure that fundraising for FTE is distributed in a manner that will help PPS close opportunity gaps. Revisions to a second policy, the parents in the schools, which is 7.10.020P, guiding organization and collaboration with parent groups in the schools, is also important and should be undertaken as a separate process that engages with PTAs and parent organizations to provide additional transparency to all the various fundraising mechanisms used in school communities.
Thank you for that explanation. So I have some things that I'm interested, some questions I have just in order to be able to have a think through the policy implications. I look forward to my list. Michelle and Herman.
Yeah.
Herman. Oh,
So, go ahead, Mr. Freed.
So, I apologize because I am a simple-minded individual. So a lot of this verbiage is really, so I want to ask some real simple questions, and I pray I don't offend anybody in the process. Is this,
Like he said, you're 3 months in, you're good, you got grace.
is this a bunch, and again, more so a bunch of well-to-do white people trying to raise money for their schools so that they can get FTE in their schools, or different people in their schools, and they want to be able to say that we want our school to have this, and that way we're going to raise the money? Because if so, if that's the case, then a lot of the marginalized schools aren't going to get stuff, and we're just going to extend the gap because rich white people are going to continue to say, we're going to pour into our schools. What I would like to see happen, if they're going to do that, is say, we love the fact that you want to raise money for FTE. We want you to raise that money. We want you to give it to us as a district, and we're going to use 100% of those dollars to do exactly what we feel is best for our district and put it into schools that we feel best need these funds, and they are just responsible for, and they say, yes, we'll raise the money, we'll put it in, and you get to use 100% of it to go where you see fit. And if that's not the case, and they say, no, we want to be able to say this, then to me, that means they showed their card on what they really want. What's the angle? Because I'm trying to figure out where this sits, because I go to a lot of schools around, and nobody in the schools that I work with has enough money to raise money for a full-time position, and yet all of them need more people in the schools. And this to me just sounds like, and again, I'm a simple man, so I may not have read it, or I may not
So we'll walk you
understand.
through some of the things. So there, it's a 25-year history program. A third of those, anyway, so there's a lot to agree with you. I think what Director,
Sorry.
Green, wow, Director
You think everybody's scary.
Carrie, is that, I think that's why you're suggesting that same conversation could be had across the different fundraising apparatuses across the district. So PTAs raise money, millions of dollars that are not accounted for. There are the nonprofits like the Japanese, they raise money just to send kids to Japan, right? And that doesn't get, so those are all nonprofits running their own operations. At least with the local school foundations over 25 years, we have some sort of mechanism to understand how much money is coming in there. And in fact, 1/3 of each dollar that you raise after $10,000, it gets put into a pot of money that gets distributed to some of the Title I schools, some of our local schools. So that ends up being about 30 to 50,000, depending on the school year, that gets shared with a George or a, and then they get to do Chavez, all those schools, exactly. So we have a list. So part of what we'll provide you is kind of a history of the last 3 or 4 years of how much money is raised from the local school foundations, how much goes out to parent fundraising or the parent fund, et cetera. So we'll give you some basic kind of information that might help just inform your thinking.
And my point is, if we fix this flat tire on the tricycle, we're still gonna have 2 flat tires on the tricycle. And in fact, we might have an even more flat tire. So I think we need to look at this figure, that's fine.
So, I think I heard in the frame of a question, I think Jonathan identified what the information is, so that's, so it's a broader overarching look. Michelle, what do you?
Yeah, I'm also concerned about the systemic approach. I really appreciate your lens on that. This is an area that I need and want to learn more about. I can see and have actually been to fundraising efforts for my neighborhood school, King Elementary, and then attended also by accident the Ainsworth School. I mean, in the same week. Actually, they were a week apart.
That's awesome.
And it was just so drastic. And in my city that I was born in, and just I would like to learn more about the system, and I'd like to see the money flows, and I'd like to see us as a community, that's parents and caregivers, put our efforts behind those Black Lives Matter signs and really balance this giving is amazing and it's benefiting people very inequitably. So yeah, I'd like to learn more about where I'd like to see the money flows. I'd like to look at it from a systems perspective, not just in a silo.
Yeah, and I'll just be upfront. So I appreciate the desire for the kind of macro look at the apparatuses. I will just name that we tried earlier in the last year to get some of this information from our PTA partners, and they resisted for a number of reasons, which we can explain more in terms of the reasons. So I just want to be all just kind of put it on the table now that we are going to share information that we have available.
I understand it's going to be very sensitive. When you are accustomed to privilege, anything towards equity feels like oppression. Get that? And I think we made a really strong commitment here in the district to actually address it. We never said it was going to be super comfortable for everybody. We're trying to address change, and I mean now's the time. We support your.
I think if you Google,
it's not going to be popular.
If you Google PTAs and equity, this is an issue nationwide, and I would really love for PPS to once again be a trendsetter in this area of equity and to take on the dysfunction and equity in PTA.
There are thousands of hits on exactly that research.
Jackson?
Kind of even broader, I'd like to understand like the differences between PTAs, booster clubs, nonprofit, and like what their ability to do in the district is, along with everything else that's mentioned.
How many ways are there to raise money in this district?
Lots of
nonprofits and
I just want to be clear, like it's all great that people are funding band and sending this to Japan and helping teachers have extra supplies in their classroom and helping us have like all of this is awesome.
Yes.
And we need to be really thoughtful about how we do this with an equity. Like we are trying to be an anti-racist school district. This is a place where we really can live that out. So this is, I'm not saying don't fundraise, I'm not saying it's bad, I'm not saying anybody's doing anything wrong. I think we can just do better.
We can operationalize our racial equity values, and this is one of those areas where the rubber's just going to probably hit the road.
It's going to be hard.
So, and just from from a context standpoint. So PPS has certain levers and connections to whether all the different entities. And so, thinking about one of my questions is like, what are the levers we have? I think for me, one of the things about the FTE is like PPS is so complicit in it because like nobody can buy a teacher unless PPS says they can. And so I'm interested in like where is it that we have leverage or we can say something. I mean, one example could be like on that first day of school when you get that sheet of what do you want to contribute to, like, I've been a parent in a school in which you pay $25 for that first thing to join the PTA or other things. And I've also like had an opportunity to pay $500. Just
I like how you have the opportunity to pay $500.
Okay, but it's, there's a lot of pressure. Do you want to have up-to-date science lab equipment in your kids' schools? Do you want like, ID booklets?
Who's gonna say no?
Yeah.
So that's a question I have is like, where are leverage points? Because just like the fund for PPS's independents or PTAs. So that's one question I have is what are leverage points? I'd like to know, having a chart, the FTE that's been purchased by individual schools, like what exactly it is over the last, just 3-year period. So we can get a sense of what that's buying. Is it buying, an instructional coach to help kids who are behind, or is it to purchase, something else that has a very specific, maybe non-equity focused, just to get the data. I'd also like to think about the timing of if we were to change that, what would be the timing that would be least disruptive, both to schools that get equity grants and schools that don't. The other thing I would be interested in, again, not for discussion now, but just to throw it out there, is I guess I'm interested whether the fund would even, if there was a decision to centralize fundraising for FTE, whether that's something the fund would want to do or be like, that's somebody else's mission. So that's another question. I want to see the equity grants the last several years. I understand last year was 16, or this year 16,000 for elementary school. Like, what is that buying? So if that 1/3 that is resulting in 16,000 goes away, what is that paying for field trips? Is it at Title I schools or schools that are getting equity grants? So like, what is that buying, and what potentially could you lose if you didn't backfill it in the budget? And then I guess the other thing I'd be interested in, like, what's best practice? Do other Oregon school districts allow FTE to be purchased? What are other school districts do in terms of foundations? So those are just some questions that I have in order to like think through. Again, I think this is a policy that has been, or a policy question that's been swirling around PPS for 20-something years.
Chairperson Edwards, I have a question in terms of, and sorry I have not been to a committee in a while, but so the committee is reviewing this proposal from the reform group. Will the committee also funnel that committee, that policy proposal through a racial equity lens, and will there be documentation behind the racial equity kind of lens exercise?
I would just anything we do that is on the agenda that we would use that as one of our first and primary filters. So yes.
Great. So, because I think there's a process where we're documenting the money. So I'd love to support the committee as with Robin, who is our director of strategic partnerships. We all have met, and I will work closely with them on that.
Well, this is why I wanted so what are the questions people have? And I think this is like the easy thing to do would be not to have a conversation about it, because this is what's happened for 20 years, and it could be, we decide, we're good with that, with these guardrails or these set of principles. And those set of principles are also gonna apply to these other groups, if we have the authority to do that. But I think that's what this is attempt to do, so I think having a hard conversation, but I think since that happened, that resolution passed in right after Measure 5, when the district had a very different level of resources. We didn't have a local option, which is $100 million. We didn't have a Student Success Act. And, it was great. We can get, X amount of FTE paid, and a third goes into this other equity fund. That, at the time, made a lot of sense. And the question is, the question is still sitting there, is that the right thing to do? If we're gonna do it, what are the guardrails and in what context, and in what system? So that's the conversation I hope to get started today. Any other questions or data that people? Okay.
I guess where are we going forward with this, I guess?
Well, I think I'm gonna capture the data requests and I'm gonna take a look at the revised policy that got sent, because I can,
I appreciate the changes they made. They are definitely listening and being part of the conversation. So they're, again, people are really trying to be equitable. I just think we're not going far enough.
Yeah, so just to the answer, the climate policy, until we get out of committee, is going to continue to be the focus. What I want to do is start the discussion instead of waiting till the end of the year and then having the conversation. So like, what data, what information do we need in order to have a discussion about it? So setting it up, we've got other things we're obviously going to do.
And I'm going to start developing a policy around all of the fundraising. So I'm going to write a more, start the process, looking at what other people are doing nationwide. And there are some places that have started this attempt. So I'm going to try to write a more global policy to be part of the conversation we have with this. So I'm going to work on that in the next couple of weeks and start getting drafts out to you.
Great. And I would ask that you, in addition to like what happening other places, engage our PTA partners or the groups that. Great. Yeah.
Just one more question or clarification, maybe not to be answered today, but appreciate the committee's desire to have the conversation. I'll just speak on behalf of staff that we are just all constantly wrestling with the give and take from our committee and just our community and the pressures that we're all in. So I just want to be also as we begin our engagement process, because it's going to take student voices, parent voices, etc., that we're also mindful of just kind of like the moment that we're in and adjust accordingly and be flexible. So I know the committee has that in mind. So I just wanted to reiterate that for the purposes of this conversation.
Thank you. We did have a proposal when we last presented in June that we bring something back to the committee in February. I did take notes of all of the questions, but there's a lot of hours of work to compile everything that's being requested. And to bring it out to the community for input, I don't think it's a matter of just talking to a few PTAs or a few people. I think it requires a full plan, which we have drafted a full community engagement plan. We're also have met with Shanice about that. There's a lot on people's plates that they're also.
So I'll just say I've had 10 years of community engagement around people like asking about this policy. So I do want to get it moving before February, because I'm afraid February then becomes next year. And also I want to be cognizant if there's a decision that if the decision is to do something different, that we also know that there is that we're heading into the budget cycle, that we can make adjustments, or backfill if that's a decision. So I also want to be thoughtful about where things, not running out of time in the spring and then being like, we missed something else. And that may be what's happened, but I also don't want it to happen unintentionally.
As far as the timing goes though, like school foundations are fundraising right now, like we can't pass a policy right now when it needs to happen like effective July 1 for a certain year. So it couldn't.
Well, that was my question, but I also when they're doing the fundraising, I'm continuing to get questions from parents about how come you guys are still allowing that? And
I do too.
And it should be fine for us to say,
this is why
hey, we've had a thorough discussion and we've decided that's okay with these conditions, or we've decided no.
So Director Bernard, I agree, and I again just want to caution this committee that we have seen in this committee historically predominantly white voices in committee conversations, whether it's this, climate justice, or the number. And there's a lot of talk about, oh, we'll get to Black people one day, we'll get to Native people one day, we'll get to the POC folks one day. And I think that just never happens. And so I just want to be cautious about how we move forward. So I agree with you. We need to have the conversation, and let's have the conversation now.
So since I haven't been the committee chair for the last 2 years,
well, I mean, just like
they say never go on the timeline of the oppressor. So
So
that's what you're saying.
I guess I would say, I feel like a lot of people that I hear this from are from the school communities that don't have the capacity to raise funds from. And so that's what I'm responding to is the
well,
school
the reform committee is.
Pardon?
I think that most of the reform committee folks are not.
I'm not talking about I'm talking about people I talk to
Got it.
out in
Okay.
the larger school
Sorry, I'm just
community.
confused because the proposal has their proposal, so I'm just a little confused. But I hear what you're saying.
It sounds like we're both saying,
Yeah, we're all saying
let's
this, yeah.
attend to this issue.
Absolutely.
It's urgent, it's important.
We also don't want
highlights
to overwhelm our
disparities.
staff.
Absolutely.
But I also don't want to say we're not going to address it, because the primary people that I hear it from are the school communities who don't have the ability to raise money for FTE.
Yeah.
And they want to know why is that okay? And we may have
We have a
a
restaurant.
rationale and sideboards that we say, and here's why it is. But I don't think that argument is made. So nobody in a wealthy white community, school community, is asking for this to happen.
I mean, aren't these all
Wait.
folks from these communities?
I'm just saying the school.
Yeah, the reform people are all people from schools that have foundations. Most of them are people who are like the president of the foundation. They're the ones that have been doing this work. And part of the rationale they've given is they want to be able to take the time and energy they've spent on fundraising to do advocacy. And so I think, the voices I'm predominantly hearing from are the people who, like me, have lived this and see the inequity. But I also think some of the fixes, again, we're not hearing from the schools that are impacted by the 4 million. Isn't it 4 million a year that we give in
It's
equity dollars?
4 million raised, 1 million to the.
1 million in equity. So the foundation's raised about 4 million a year, and it's 1 million that goes to the equity fund. So those schools that are getting that 1 million are not the ones that I've been hearing from. And so I want to make sure that when we do make these changes to this policy, that we aren't disadvantaging those schools that are getting $1 million in extra funds.
That's why I want to front load it in the budget process. For example, if the decision were made, it's we're not going to do that anymore.
Right.
Okay, $1 million in the budget process, that is, something that the board can solve for in the budget process. And so it's not hey, we're gonna make a decision, and by the way, you're gonna lose this money. I mean, that could be the decision, but also we do have last year had $1 billion budget.
But as we talk about the levers we can use, if we're having fund raise $4 million, if we're having PTAs raise millions of dollars, if we're having our language emerging nonprofits raise millions of dollars, I do think we as a broader community, and part of our role as the board members would be ambassadors to the community. I think our role within the broader community is to have a really conversation about how does money show up in our schools, who's bringing it, who does it benefit and who decides where it gets spent. Because I just know from my own experience that we were able to buy computers for my school, my daughter's school, which is great, and do all these other things that then weren't happening at my friend who is the PTA president at Woodlawn. So yes, the district has done equity funding in our budget, so Woodlawn's getting more in some ways, but we need to have a strategic conversation about how are we funding our schools as a community, and that includes all of the parent fundraising. And so I really appreciate that the reform group has heard that we don't want to, because my fear is if we just pull the plug on all local school foundations, that $4 million will then go to PTAs and there won't be any million for the other schools. So that's why I think this is a bigger, more global conversation about the justice of money in our system.
Okay, and we've already discussed that we're gonna do that. So I think we're good with that, but we're also just not gonna not have the conversation, because I think that is, having the hard conversation, and it was what needs to happen, and then we make a decision, and then we all are ambassadors out. But it's hard to be an ambassador right now.
When we don't have a decision.
Right.
And I think we can say this is a conversation we're having, that this has been the practice, and yet this is something we're continuing to evaluate as we live into our anti-racist and equity values.
Right, and I feel like, so.
But I do feel like we're overwhelmingly hearing from white voices about this issue, at least formally in the committee.
And in the budget sessions, they're probably already getting in line. I mean, we're just gonna have to be very intentional about listening to people that don't show up, aren't in line for the budget conversations. I think we'll have to just do a targeted approach to our.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I look at the list of schools, and like I know people in all the schools that raise a lot of money for FTE.
Mm-hmm.
And I know people in the other schools, but they're not
in line advocating. They're not.
Well, I think Shanice did a masterful job on the climate justice policy to really bring in those other voices that maybe the committee had missed, the parent advocacy group. And so I think, as we continue to work together on these conversations, that's your department is hitting home runs on the work you're doing.
So I'm hearing we're gonna.
So, and I also want to be super cognizant, because at 6 o'clock,
It's 6:07.
yeah, so we only have 23. Yep. But of course, we'll extend the meeting for superintendent. I didn't see here. And then he's going to have the second last word.
I'll try to constrain myself to just 3 sentences with maybe semicolons. So I'm glad that we're taking a look at foundations, parent fundraising, its role in the district. We should apply a racial equity lens to it, just like all of our other policies and practices. What I would hope that we don't unintentionally do is have a chilling effect on parents or philanthropic contributions that benefit our students. I just want to remind everyone that this might be a longstanding issue, because there was a time when the school district just budgeted sort of in an equal per pupil manner. And that's just not been the case under this administration the last few years. Open up volume 2, you will note that in many of those schools that don't have the fundraising capacity, they're being funded, in some cases, double or more than what other schools are funded at. And so we know that capacity may not exist there, and that there's a need for staff. And guess what? We've allocated additional staff, whether it's for academic or social emotional interventions, or in some cases, additional APs to give them leadership capacity. So I just want to make sure we look at the whole picture of the way that we're equitably resourcing schools to create equitable conditions across the entire district school portfolio when we have this conversation. I just want to comment on, I think what you're hearing is a reservation from staff in committing the proper energy and attention to doing a community engagement effort when we have already embarked on a few major areas where staff is already over capacity on time and effort, and a few other new ideas that have also been proposed for winter and spring. So Otherwise, we'll be we'll expose ourselves to the critique that we're not doing it well, and that could be the risk if we try to take on too much there. So I'll keep my comments limited there.
Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your thoughts about that and pointing out the equity funding that is now baked into our budget. So I'm gonna assume there's no other business. Everybody should know that the climate policy will be a primary focus. We potentially will have a first discussion about the policy on the terms of employment for non-represented staff in the next 2 meetings, and we'll continue on with rescissions. Thank you, everybody, for your engagement. Thank you so much for the great